You mentioned the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, now it's not so much in spotlight as more of the news concentrates on what is going on between Israel, Hamas, and the situation in the Gaza Strip. So suddenly we see that Ukraine is not number one, at least not in the foreign policy topics. Do you see any possible way out of the conflict? I mean, a peaceful way out, or at least a satisfactory way out of this conflict? As you mentioned, this is really a proxy war. Of course, the Ukraine is a pawn simply in the game, and in effect, it's a war of Russia against NATO, especially against the United States. So, is there a possible change, for example, coming with the next election in the United States, or is it just wishful thinking?
Well, the thing we should understand, if you're playing poker and you have a lousy hand, and each time it comes to you, you raise the ante. And when the opponent matches you, meets you, you up the ante, even though your hand is lousy. Maybe you're bluffing, or maybe you don't know how to play poker. But that is what the West has done with Russia. Because the West said, we're going to expand NATO to Ukraine. And at first, Russia didn't say, we're going to conquer the territory. Russia just said, don't do that. We respect Ukraine's borders. And all we want is a long-term lease for our naval fleet in Sevastopol. And that was what Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, delivered between 2010 and 2013. A long-term lease for Russia and neutrality. Okay, we don't want to join NATO. It's, we're in between. Then the United States and Europe really helped to overthrow Yanukovych. We should be clear about this. In February 2014, the United States played a direct role in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And they brought in an anti-Russian government. And at that point, President Putin said, okay, we're not going to let Crimea fall into NATO hands. So we'll organize a referendum, and the people of Crimea, no doubt, overwhelmingly were Russian and wanted to be part of Russia, and voted to become part of Russia. The West said, no, this is completely unacceptable. Then the Russian regions of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, of course, said, we don't like this new government. It's very radical. It's very anti-Russian. It's trying to cancel Russian culture and Russian language. We want autonomy. And the two breakaway republics of Lugansk and Donetsk took place. And the Ukrainian government attacked them as renegade provinces, but it militarily attacked them. And then came the Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, to stop the fighting. And Minsk II, in particular, was endorsed by the UN Security Council. And Russia didn't say, we're going to take the Donbass. Russia just said, honor the Minsk II agreement, which gives autonomy to these regions and respect for the Russian language and Russian culture. Pretty reasonable, actually. But the Ukrainians and the Americans said, no way. We're not going to honor an agreement, even though the UN Security Council adopted it. And so Minsk II was never implemented. And interestingly, Chancellor Merkel of Germany was supposed to be a guarantor of Minsk II. And then she admitted in a press conference a year ago, oh, we didn't really mean it. It just gave time for Ukraine to strengthen its defenses and so forth. Well, this is very cynical and very destructive. But the reason I mention it is Russia was not calling for Ukrainian territory, except we raised the stakes in this poker game. And then Russia said, okay, we'll take Crimea. And the United States said, and we want autonomy for the Russian regions. No, we raised the stakes, no autonomy. And then Russia said at the end of 1991, look, this situation is not controlled. Minsk is not being enforced. NATO is still intending to enlarge to Ukraine. This is the last chance. We demand negotiations with the United States. And President Putin put on the table a draft agreement with the U.S. on December 17, 2021. And the United States said, no, we're not negotiating any of that with you. That's arrogance. They did it again. I called the White House at the end of 2021 and spoke with senior official and said, negotiate with Russia, avoid the war. Oh, don't worry, Professor Sachs. Of course, the United States rejected negotiations and the special military operation started. Now, this is also very interesting. At the time of the special military operation, the two regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, claimed independence. Russia did not annex them until September 2022. They claimed independence. Of course, the United States said no, but immediately Zelensky said, okay, we can negotiate with Russia. And in March 2022, there were negotiations, and they were actually going to reach an outcome of Ukrainian neutrality and an end to the war. And then what happened? The United States stepped in and said, no, don't do that. We don't accept that. Well, how stupid is that? You have a losing hand, but they raised the ante one more time. Now, why did they do that? Because they're basically ignorant. In this case, they didn't understand how bad their hand was. They looked at their cards and they said, we're going to impose economic sanctions, and this will bring Russia to its knees. And we will ship HIMARS missiles, and this will destroy the Russian military. This is a fantasy world of these people, these neocons in Washington. So they raised the stakes one more time. They said no to a negotiated peace. They said no to Ukrainian neutrality. And the war continued. And now where are we in this advanced stage of the war? Russia is absolutely destroying one Ukrainian army after another. This is obvious. And the much talked about Ukrainian counteroffensive that was supposed to take place in June 2023 and reach the Sea of Azov. Of course, it didn't reach anything. It didn't do anything other than kill tens of thousands of Ukrainians and cost an unbelievable amount of money in destroyed tanks, weapon systems, artillery, everything. So it's been a disaster. These are the worst poker players I've ever seen. All they do with a lousy hand is keep raising the stakes and keep losing.
Maybe now they are trying to shift focus, shift attention to Gaza or maybe to some other conflicts, because actually when you are losing in one, then you can try to induce more chaos.
You asked me a question which I didn't answer. I gave a long answer.
If there is a way out.
No, but you asked me a question, what to do. And the point I would make is the first thing we should do is stop raising the ante, Stop saying, oh, we're going to defeat them. It's easy. We're going to beat them. No, Ukraine's not going to defeat Russia. And the more that this goes on, the more dead Ukrainians there are. That's just the most basic point. And the whole society has been so profoundly wounded because millions and millions of Ukrainians are in Europe or are in Russia, and hundreds of thousands are dead because of this. So the population has collapsed, and there aren't young people anymore. Now they want to draft kids and young women because they've run out of soldiers. It's terrible. And so we need to stop raising the ante. Now, what would that mean? We need to negotiate. We need to say first, okay, NATO is not enlarging, but Russia, you have to stop taking more and more Ukraine. And what the Russians are going to say at this point is, okay, we keep the following territories. And we're going to have to negotiate over that, because the idea that, no, we don't make any concessions, you're just going to be defeated, is going to end up destroying all of Ukraine. It's raising the stakes on a lousy hand. And we should recognize that we are going to need a political outcome right now, not the one we wanted, but we were so dumb not to take a better deal a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that now we're in a situation where we're not going to get exactly what we, quote, want. But to continue the fighting would absolutely destroy even more.
What worries me most is actually that really the lives of Ukrainians are just taken as a casualty, as something not even worth speaking about.
They don't even talk about it. The leadership is absolutely gross. You know, I'm sure that Zelensky is in a very hard place, but all he talks about right now is throwing more lives to the graves. Frankly, no strategy, no self-awareness, no situational awareness. Okay, it's very sad because the United States talked him out of a peace agreement in March 2022. That was Zelensky's chance, and he lost it. He was inexperienced. You know, when the United States comes and tells you, we have your back, you tend to believe it if you're inexperienced. I tried to tell him, by the way, I really tried to tell the Ukrainians, look, I'm an old guy. I've been through lots of U.S. wars, Vietnam War, Nicaragua, the Gulf Wars, Syria. They never win. Are you kidding? Do you really want to end up like Afghanistan? And they didn't believe me. They just thought, oh, you're a Putin apologist. So they didn't want to hear any of this. But I was telling them the hard facts about American wars, and they didn't want to hear it.
Besides Russia, I'm not sure that Ukraine actually is such a big topic in American policy. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it's
maybe
definitely
Israel.
You know, it's a big focus of the political class still, the military-industrial complex and the White House. Maybe for just political reasons that Biden doesn't want to admit what a lousy poker player he is. But the point is, for the American people, they've had enough. There's no groundswell of support. People don't want that. They want to stop this thing. And so in that sense, you're absolutely right. Typically, the public doesn't have much say in this. We have almost no public debate. But Biden's popularity is really collapsing. And if the unhappiness with Biden's foreign policy is very, very clear. So maybe even public opinion is going to start playing a role because we're now in an election year.
I would like to ask you to clear the position on China, because when I look both at the Republicans or at the Democrats, I would say that their views on China are very similar. So they actually have very hostile views towards China. Now there was a summit, APEC, where both presidents, Biden and Xi Jinping, met. Do you see any decline in tension, any hopes that actually the relations, they're probably not going to be friendly, but let's say at least stabilize and would be less threatening for the world?
I'll tell you an interesting thing. When President Xi came to this APEC summit in San Francisco, he met 200 U.S. business leaders, and they gave him a standing ovation. I don't think they would give an American president a standing ovation, but they gave President Xi a standing ovation. Why? China's their biggest market. They both produce in China, they sell in China, they make a lot of money in China, and they want normal relations. What is happening is two things. One, we have a kind of security class in America who are all about American dominance, American hegemony, America being number one. It's a very strange group of people, but this is our foreign policy establishment. Then we have politicians who basically think that, and it's very particular, Trump in 2016 won the election by winning swing states in the middle of America, in the American Midwest, which is our industrial zone. And he won it by saying, China took your jobs away. And when he made narrow victories in those states, the Democrats said, oh, we have to attack China in order to compete politically with Trump. So there are two reasons for the anti-China sentiment in the United States. One, and in the political class, one is this idea of America being the only dominant country. Well, I mean, unless you're playing a board game like the game of Risk, you don't get to be the dominant country in the world when there are other big countries around. So this is arrogance, again, very misguided. Then there is this protectionist politics, which tries to appeal to a few swing states in the U.S. elections. The upshot of this is that the political class, both Democrats and Republicans, are pretty united against China, pretty ignorant from my experience. They don't know China. They don't know Chinese history. They don't have any perspective. They play a dangerous game, like when our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, flew to Taiwan. So stupid. Sorry. Just why do you want to provoke another superpower?
Thank you for saying that, because we have the same representatives who are also provoking China in this country.
Okay, don't provoke China. Be respectful. Just have normal relations. Don't provoke a superpower. Why? What is in it to poke a superpower? It's stupid. People should think. If there's even if you think there's a bully, which China's not, but if you think there's a bully in the schoolyard and you're a little kid and you think they're the bully, is it really smart to go poking them and say, you're a bully, I hate you? No, you're going to get hurt in the end. So you need some common sense. And China's not even bullying. China is just big, successful, dynamic, actually a good trade partner for Europe. So we should treat it normally, respectfully. And the U.S. anxieties should not be Europe's anxieties. This is another area where European politicians are just repeating the words of American politicians. And I know behind the scenes, although it's obvious, why does van der Leyen repeat words almost like Biden? Because she feels that her job is to be with the United States. Maybe she hopes the United States appoints her as the Secretary General of Nato or something. I don't know what it is. No, but that's what she hopes maybe. So this is where Europe makes a big mistake. Just like it did make a big mistake in Ukraine, it would make a big mistake of trying to make an enemy out of China. That's a completely ridiculous losing proposition.
My last question, because our time is coming up, I have to reflect one very current event you already mentioned, and that's the elections in Argentina.
Yes.
Because let's say that the elected president is unusual personality. How do you view this situation? Is there a danger for BRICS or maybe for other Latin American countries with his very strange suggestions as for foreign policy, as for economics?
Yeah, of course, time will tell. One thing is he won the presidency, but has no control over the Congress. His small parties, and at least for the moment, doesn't have any kind of governing coalition in the Congress. So maybe his ability to do things will require a much broader coalition of forces, and that could be a constraint. But let me just say first, Argentina is a country that has been unstable for its whole history, going back to the 1820s, ever since independence. Argentina has messed up more currencies, had more inflation, and more instability than any other place on the entire planet. This guy won not because of what he says, but because of disgust with the outgoing government, which was delivering inflation of triple digits, more than 100%. You can't really win an election when inflation is triple digit. And I know Argentina quite well, and actually worked with the finance minister just before this one. And he was doing a good job, and he ended up being not forced out. He resigned, unfortunately. But he resigned because his own, I would say, corrupt politicians in his own party were rejecting the normal policies that he was trying to promote. So Argentina is now in yet another cycle of instability. All my professional career as an economist, I've been watching Argentina in amazement, because it's not an impoverished country by any means, and it's got huge natural wealth and very smart people, well-educated class of people, but it has made such a political mess repeatedly, and this could be yet another one. I don't want to say on the first day after the election of this guy that he'll really govern the way he campaigned, because sometimes they become a lot more responsible, but it could be that he's that he is what he says he is, in which case Argentina is going to face some real troubles. It's regrettable, because I'm a fan of the BRICS. I would like to see them work. Argentina is a new member of the BRICS group. Whether this guy stays in or out of the BRICS or gets kicked out of the BRICS, everything remains to be seen. But I only hope that this guy was making this as a persona, not as a real politics, because his real politics, if delivered this way, would be very, very detrimental to Argentina.
In light of the United States-India summit held in Washington in June, do you think the meeting between President Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also highlights a shift in the global balance of power?
A profound and extensive change is taking place in the world. Let's put it this way. The non-Western parts of the world are experiencing rapid economic growth. I'm talking about countries like India, China, certain parts of Africa, and Latin America, which were poor in the past 2 centuries, but are currently showing significant progress in catching up. If you consider the European Union, with a population of around 450 million, and the United States with 335 million inhabitants, it accounts for only 10% of the world's population. So the majority of the world, which is still relatively poor, but reducing the gap, lies outside of this.
Seeing this, do you think the United States and the West can accept that there is a certain shift towards developing countries? In fact, it's not just towards developing countries, but towards economic powers such as China or India. Will the West accept that it no longer exclusively wields global influence?
I believe that Europe roughly understands this, although ideas about a European empire still arise occasionally. But these are mostly remnants of the past. In the United States, there is a very strong financial and ideological entity known as the military-industrial complex, which currently does not accept this viewpoint. In my opinion, it represents a significant destabilizing factor in the world. This entity still wants the United States to be dominant over Russia and China. They think that the United States will create an anti-China alliance with India, but this is a very naive and unrealistic notion. I think the majority of the American people are not concerned about whether the United States is the first, second, or fifth largest power in the world because we have so many problems at home. The American people would be completely happy if their government focused on the problems that have accumulated domestically. However, the mentioned military-industrial complex is a strong and dominant player in American foreign policy, which still imagines that the United States is the leading superpower. Furthermore, many European countries, at least currently, subscribe to this idea because many European leaders confuse the European Union with NATO and unfortunately equate them, which is a regrettable mistake. So, my answer is that a good and peaceful transition to a truly multipolar world is possible, but there are those who oppose it in the United States.
You mentioned the defense industry, which is a huge economic sector and a source of revenue and profit for the industries involved. This brings us immediately to the issue of the war in Ukraine, in which Russia is the aggressor. Yet the question arises, who benefits from peace and ending this bloody war?
This war broke out because the United States insisted on NATO expanding eastward and pushed for this to happen in Ukraine and Georgia as well. However, Ukraine and Georgia are red lines that cannot be crossed for Russia. Don't do it, the Russians said. The United States, however, was so dismissive, despite the fact that for 3 decades, Russia has been saying, don't dare bring your missiles, bases, and armies to Ukraine, that America thought they were just bluffing. What could Russia do, as it is so weak, and we can do whatever we want? However, President Putin called their bluff. The United States still insists on NATO's presence in Ukraine, and even NATO leaders say they will, of course, expand the organization to Ukraine. Most European leaders, with the exception of Prime Minister Orban, say that NATO will naturally expand to Ukraine. But this is the recipe for endless war and crisis. Thus, the Russian-Ukrainian war was provoked by American aspirations for hegemony. And if we had left Russia alone, had not confronted it with the possibility of NATO expansion in Ukraine, this war would never have broken out.
At the same time, Washington argues that Western military support only serves to assist Ukraine in protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States claims to support Ukraine as long as necessary. But where are the hopes for a peace agreement?
There could have been peace in December 2021 when President Putin put a draft agreement on the table with the United States, which was based on Ukraine's neutrality. But Washington rejected it. There could have been peace in April 2022 when Russia and Ukraine negotiated an agreement based on Ukraine's neutrality. The United States rejected that too. The day when the President of the United States, Joe Biden, came out in public and said that Russia must call home its army and the United States will never allow NATO to expand to Ukraine. This could have been the basis for ending the war. But Biden is unwilling to say this because he disagrees. He has been among those who support NATO expansion for 30 years, as does his environment, as do the top brass of the American military, the generals. They do not want peace. They want continuing war until the United States achieves its goal.
I attended a press conference led by John Kirby, the spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, who argued that the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy is one of cooperation. Over the past 2 years, however, we have seen unprecedented political and economic division develop globally. This raises the question, how effective is this cooperative foreign policy, and how successful is it?
In this sense, Biden is a neoconservative, having been part of the aforementioned military-industrial complex throughout his congressional career as vice president and now as president. He doesn't support collaboration with others whom he calls allies and friends. He says that the greatest challenge and basis for division in the world today is the divide between democracies and autocracies. However, this is nonsense, and it's dangerous because the world is not structured that way, and it should not be so bifurcated. The world should be unified in order to face common challenges, whether it's in regards to the functioning of the world economy, the preservation of the natural environment, or the ever-increasing uncertainty. And yet we don't do this, but instead try to expand NATO, increase military budgets, and speak aggressively about China. After Secretary of State Blinken's seemingly reasonable and constructive visit to Beijing, the next day, President Biden restarted and called President Xi Jinping a dictator. One wonders what kind of China policy this is. The world does not want this kind of destabilization. It does not need this foreign policy. The United States must contribute to ending the war in Ukraine, understanding that Russia also has legitimate security interests. These must be negotiated also to protect Ukraine and ensure that the security interests of every country are upheld.
We are in need of this dialogue for two basic reasons that I'd like to elaborate just briefly. One is we are in a new world in these years, and we're trying to navigate a new world. By that I mean the world that we have thought we knew in some places, a rather naive idea, was a Western-led world. And that was an idea that predominated from roughly 1820 to, I would say, the middle of the 20th century. But the notion of Western-led world continued at least until the end of the 20th century. That world is finished, but we don't know it yet. And it's that ignorance of the end of the Western-led world which is at the heart of the very, very serious tensions between the United States and China, for example, because the Western-led world has finished, the United States doesn't know it, and this means that we have a very deep misunderstanding about the nature of our current global reality. The second reason why we are here is that all together we are wrecking the world, the natural environment. So this is a feature of common humanity for a common global commons, which is the title of our meeting. I'd like to say just a few words about how we got here to give you my perspective. For most of the known history of the last 2 millennia, there was no question that Asia was the center of the world economy because it was well over half of the world population. The nature of life pretty much across the world did not vary so widely. So what we would call per capita incomes were similar. People were small farmers in villages, and this was true whether it was in Western Europe, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was in Chinese villages, whether it was in African villages. The population of the world was, from 1 AD onward, enormous in the Indian subcontinent and in China. And this meant that Asia was the center of gravity, if you would make that calculation of the world economy as well as of the world demography. More than that, China was the dynamic country of the world technology and many civilizational inventions, especially during the Song dynasty from 960 to 1279, till the Mongol conquests. The Song dynasty was a remarkable period of technological fecundity, of economic gain, of multiple fundamental inventions, from the use of the compass for navigation, paper currency, public administration, ocean navigation, movable type printing, and countless other inventions that changed the world fundamentally. So not only was China populous, but China was really dominant. And throughout much of Asia, and especially East Asia, it was China that set the civilizational patterns for what is today's countries of Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea. And this civilization, which was a Neo-Confucian civilization, was a remarkable achievement. At this time, we had the high medieval period in Western Europe, and some breakthroughs were starting, a lot of wars, by the way, and but Europe would have looked to any observer at the time as a taker of technology, a receiver of technology, not as a maker or giver of technology. And the technology came from the East in many directions, from the Arab world, from the Indian subcontinent, from China. There are some notable dates. The worst economic policy mistake in human history was made by China in 1434, when the Ming Dynasty decided to end ocean navigation and to scrap the fleet of Admiral Zheng He. Because China would have discovered the New World, it would have discovered the Americas, it would have created a world economy. But China was concerned, the court was concerned about the incursions from the north, not from the gains of ocean navigation, and the great fleet of Admiral Zheng was ended, and those were the end of the ocean navigations. The oceans were given over to the Europeans, actually. This was really one of the most decisive own goals of human history, I have to say. Now, the next date that's important is 1492, because as China vacated the oceans, Portugal and Spain filled the oceans using Chinese technology, by the way, the ocean navigation and the gunpowder, which all had come from China, to begin an age of navigation. Still, without the fortuitous fact that heading west from Europe landed a continent that was not known to the Europeans, history would not have changed all that fundamentally. But the Americas became a resource base for Europe's development for the next 4 centuries, which fundamentally changed the world. And Adam Smith, writing in 1776, said that the 2 most significant events in the history of mankind were the discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492 and the discovery of the path around the Cape of Good Hope by Vasco da Gama in 1498. So that was a turning point. Still, Asia was dominant, but this little peninsula on the far west of Eurasia began to explore and ironically conquered the Americas, and that was by virtue of pathogens rather than any dominance, because the Europeans brought smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, and many other diseases, and wiped out the Native American populations by around 95%, and were able to conquer, therefore, 2 continents of massive resource base. So history began to change. The next date that I would suggest is fundamental is 1776. That's a very interesting year. 4 things happened that year. You know some of them. The most important was James Watt patented the steam engine in that year. A second decisive event was that Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. The third decisive event was that Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then there was something, a Declaration of Independence of some country also. All happened in that year. But the invention of the steam engine was a turning point as significant as 1434 and 1492, because though the steam engine had been invented by China, it had not been utilized by any scale in China. China had invented the steam engine about 700 years earlier. Watt improved the steam engine with a condenser, and Britain became the first industrial country. And this was very significant because in 1839, my next date, Britain invaded China in the First Opium War. The war fought to make the world safe for opium addiction. Really a sordid act, but just an illustration of what had changed fundamentally in power. From China's dominance, now China was in defeat by the British, by a British expeditionary force from not quite halfway around the world, but was able to defeat the Chinese Ming or Qing, Qing Empire. Of course, I won't go into long history, but the defeats in the two Opium Wars was followed by the Taiping Rebellion and by probably the worst civil war perhaps in human history in terms of the human toll in the Taiping Rebellion. And China went from being an absolute great power to being a subjected country, and one that faced extreme poverty and hardship later in invasion by many imperial powers along the coast, and then the invasion by Japan starting in 1894, 95, and then in the 20th century. For me, the next turning point is 1947 and 1949, the independence of India and the independence of China. I think there's one key point in history, which is a colonized or imperialized country cannot achieve economic development or success because it is not in the interest of the imperial power to have success in its colonies. The interest of an imperial power is extraction. And so until independence came after this terrible 100 years, China and India were left behind, far behind economic development. So the next turning point in history was the middle of the 20th century when Asia began to recover. And if you look statistically, Asia had been around 60% of world output for 1800 years roughly, from as much as one can measure this, from 1 AD to roughly 1800 AD. And then by 1950, it had declined to 15%, or perhaps 20% of world output, though the population was still 60%. So the per capita income had collapsed. What we are experiencing now is the recovery of normality, not something outside of human experience, but actually the recovery of normality, because what was abnormal was that a small part of the world, the North Atlantic region, would so dominate the whole world. And that was by virtue of the technological advances, starting with steam engine, and then the militarization of those technologies, which led to a century of imperial domination by Western countries. This would have lasted longer, but the West fought two disastrous, bloody civil wars, World War I and World War II, and by the end of that period, it was, of course, morally, politically, economically, financially, militarily incapable of empire. And with some lagging battles, the countries found their way to independence. So Asia began to recover dramatically fast. And by around 2010, China was larger than the US economy in absolute size, measured in purchasing power terms. But not surprising, because China is more than 4 times the US population, or was then. Now it's about 4 times the US population. And so naturally it would become a bigger country. 2 implications, and I'll stop here. One is that now that the whole world is industrializing, and we're going to have development everywhere. India was behind China by about 15 or 20 years, but now India is growing faster than China, is likely to continue to do so. Africa is going to grow faster than both India and China in the next 40 years, because it's going to be catching up from farther back. And by the way, Africa right now has the same size population as China and India. All are 1.4 billion. But Africa will be the biggest by mid-century, by far. So if there's an African Union, the African Union will be the most populous part of the world by 2050, by far. And it will be a dynamic part of the world economy also. So we're going to have lots of mindset changes in the years ahead. But there are 2 significant conclusions from this. One is mainly the United States has been shocked at China's rise. And I have to say to my Chinese friends, you didn't ask permission, you know? The US is supposed to be in charge. And now, without US permission, you became so big and powerful, and that is a bit unforgivable in the American mentality. The Americans cannot figure it out because they know no history at all, I'm sorry to say. We're doing our best as teachers, but we're not doing very well. So the idea that what's happened in China is a return to normal is ununderstandable. And this is why there's so much tension right now. So it's very serious. And the tension came when China declared in the Made in China 2025 program, we will become key leaders of leading technologies. That was the biggest affront to the Americans. I say, bravo, go for it. This is good for the world. Technological advance anywhere lifts everyone, by the way, as long as it's not militarized and leads to destruction, but as long as it's used for human well-being. And by the way, Chinese technologies are already core to saving the world. Whether it's medicines like artemisinin, or whether it's the lowest cost solar production, solar modules, this is Chinese technology and we need it. It's going to be critical for world well-being. But one thing is the tension coming with China's recovery. We need dialogue on this to understand it. So that's one part. Second is that as the whole world economy has grown roughly 100 times since James Watt's steam engine, I would say realistically maybe 250 times since James Watt's steam engine, we're wrecking the natural environment. We really are. It's extremely serious. It's very late in the day. And so we need a common understanding of how we're going to get our own now globally shared technologies under control. So that is why I'm so happy to be here. I do think we're going to figure this out. But the strangest part of globalization is how little global dialogue there is. It's the paradox. It's so easy to have connection. You can get on a Zoom with anybody, but it's a big event if an American official talks to a Chinese official. It should be happening dozens of times a day, not top news. And I keep offering to President Biden, I'll give you a Zoom link. You can call President Putin and make peace. Or a phone number. I'll lend you my cell phone. Make a call. But here we are completely interconnected, but we don't talk with each other. And the specialty of the church is talking with each other. So here we are. Thank you very much.
I think the explanation is straightforward. The neocons are not interested in strategic balance or strategic stability. They're interested in global hegemony. They adopt and pursue the idea that the United States is, should be, and can remain the world's sole superpower. This is absurd in substance, because the United States is not, cannot, and should not be the world's sole superpower. The United States is 4.2% of the world population. It should do its share. It should be responsible. It should promote strategic balance, not hegemony, or what some in the U.S. security state call full spectrum dominance. The neocons are not interested in balance. They are therefore actually undermining balance wherever it is. The whole reason for the war in Ukraine is the United States could not accept a mutually respectful peace with Russia. The United States had to keep moving NATO eastward to surround Russia. The United States does not accept a mutually respectful relationship with China. The United States wants to surround China with its military bases and military alliances. This is why the situation is so destabilizing, because the United States is not, and by the United States, by the way, I don't mean the US people, I mean the security state, which is dominated by this arrogance of unipolarity. They're not seeking stability, they're seeking dominance. And seeking dominance is not only, I think, immoral, but utterly impracticable, because the United States is not dominant. It is one of many powerful countries in the world, but there are many major powers in the world, and the United States seems intent to take them on. It won't succeed, but it will leave bloodshed, massive bloodshed, in the places that are trapped between the superpower fights, and Ukraine is the latest victim. It was a victim that was talked into its role by promises by the United States that we'll defeat Russia together. Of course, in the end, Russia is not defeated, but Ukraine is reduced to rubble. And this is unfortunately the American tendency.
Now, where do you think leaves us this insight, like for neutrality and non-alignment, especially for countries that are really kind of trying to be non-aligned, not this kind of lapdog neutrality that Austria and Switzerland and Ireland are going, because they have already been captured pretty much by the ideology, by the same ideology. But those states in Africa, South America, and India and Southeast Asia that don't want to go along, I mean, this puts a target on them as well, right? The United States will see any kind of third-party policy as inherently antagonistic. I mean, these neocons, the Victoria Nuland types.
Well, I think that from a strategic point of view, each region needs to get together so it's not picking off one country at a time, but actually regions cooperating. So I strongly advocate that ASEAN work together as a group. I advocate that the South American countries, indeed, it would be good if the Latin American and Caribbean countries, but at least the regions work together as a group. The United States approach is divide and conquer, the old strategy that dates back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. So it picks off Venezuela, and then it divides Latin America between those who are on the U.S. side against Venezuela and those who are on the Venezuelan side. But what, of course, is the right response for Latin America is don't be divided that way. If you are divided that way, everybody loses. Millions of refugees from Venezuela that came from a brutal and premeditated attempt by the United States to overthrow the Maduro government. And who pays the consequences? All of the region, of course, Venezuela first in a shocking collapse of the economy and social life, but Colombia and other neighboring countries that have become home to millions of refugees from Venezuela. So I'm extremely happy, although it's very difficult, that Lula is back in the presidency in Brazil, because Lula can bring together the Latin American governments to say to the United States also, look, we're not your enemy, but stop dividing us. Stop trying to overthrow governments in our region, because we don't want that. And that really needs to be the response everywhere. The United States traps countries in proxy wars, and those countries lose. I tried to tell my Ukrainian counterparts, they were at that time my Ukrainian friends, then they stopped listening to me and wanting to repudiate what I was saying, but I kept warning them, you are going to get trapped by the United States. And this is exactly what has happened.
Do you have any more hope for Taiwan? Because it seems to me the US is trying to do exactly the same now, with preparing Taiwan to be an unsinkable aircraft carrier and then have bloodshed without end on Taiwan in order to fight a proxy war with China.
I was just in Taiwan. I was given a wonderful award called the Tang Prize by a fantastic foundation. I spoke to a major Buddhist foundation in Taiwan, the Tzu Chi Foundation. And what a wonderful society, what a successful place. And I gave the warning everywhere that I could, don't get trapped into this U.S. PRC fight, because this would be devastating. The United States basically is led by a lot of ignoramuses. I happen to know a lot of them. They're very poorly educated. They're educated in a kind of American arrogance. They are outdated by 30 years, thinking that the world is just at the U.S. Doorstep, or that the U.S. has the prerogatives, I should say better, anywhere in the world. They don't know what they're doing. And I tried to say to Taiwanese leaders, be careful, because this is really what happened in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. approach is so mind-bogglingly wrong-headed. It says the way to protect a country is to arm it. Well, this is the fallacy that my late and great colleague at Columbia University, Robert Jervis, wrote about for decades, what he called the security dilemma. The United States may look at arming a country as a, quote, defensive action, but from the point of view of the country on the other side of that arming, that looks like a pretty aggressive action, and it therefore triggers a response. It triggers a retaliation. It makes conflict more likely. So the United States poured arms into Ukraine after 2014. It thought it was going to make peace that way. Well, yeah, maybe some of these dunderheads in Washington believed that, but of course it was leading towards conflict. And the idea that the way to protect Taiwan is by making Taiwan what they call in Washington a porcupine, so armed that it won't be touched, with all those quills protecting it. This is absurd. The arms shipments would only make Taiwan more and more endangered, more and more at risk. The way to reduce, even eliminate these risks is diplomacy. Diplomacy between the United States and China, diplomacy between Taiwanese leaders and mainland Chinese leaders. Talk with each other. For heaven's sake, there is an absolute vital interest on both sides of the Taiwan Straits for peace. There really is. And if the United States would just get out of the way for a moment and the two sides could talk with each other, they'd actually find a way forward. But the United States comes in with its naive and destabilizing promises. We'll keep you safe. Yeah, they'll keep Taiwan safe like they kept Afghanistan safe, like they kept South Korea safe, like they kept Ukraine safe. In other words, not at all. And how many failures do these neocons, how many failures are they going to have before they are finally taken off the pedestal of power? By the way, it's not that the American people believe any of this. It's just that we don't have a functioning representative government. Our foreign policy has been taken in the hands of Raytheon and General Dynamics and these neocons. The American people are asked nothing about this. So this is not a reflection of the martial spirit of the American people, although our mainstream media feed a lot of absolute falsehoods to the American people. But it is the fact that foreign policy is in the hands of the security state, that is governed economically by the military-industrial complex, which funds the major committees in Congress, which provide the votes and the money for a $1 trillion plus annual military outlay. And that's where we are right now. It's absolutely awful. In the United States, foreign policy is the small preserve of the military-industrial complex.
I share that analysis with you. The oxymoron to me is that the United States keeps talking about itself. So, and I apologize again, the same people that you're talking about keep talking about the United States as a force for good and a force for peace, when in reality, the United States is highly militarized, highly militaristic, and reacts to conflict always with military components. That surprises me.
Well, I would add, I think since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been the most militarized and most violent country in the world. And this is just a matter of record. One recent scholarly account, a very good one, counted 70 U.S.-led regime change operations between 1947 and 1989. So the study was over the Cold War period. And just in that period, 1947 to 1989, 70 regime change operations, 6 of which were overt wars to overthrow a foreign government, and 64 were covert operations. Now, this is stunning. First of all, covert operations don't remain covert. It's pretty obvious if you're a reader of the New York Times, which wants you to suck your thumb and go to sleep. But if you're a thinker who's looking at the actual evidence, pretty clear when the U.S. is covertly overthrowing another government like it tried to do in Syria. Now, the point is that this is the normal U.S. modus operandi: war, coups, and overthrows. And after 1989, the big change wasn't that the United States stopped that behavior. The big change was the United States thought it could get away with anything, whether in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria. In 2011, Obama and Hillary, well, they decided, okay, we're going to overthrow Assad. That was just a conscious decision. And 12 years later, they left that country in shambles because they're fools. What do they think? that they can dictate? By the way, they said, both Obama and Trump, okay, we're going to overthrow Maduro. We'll do it through economic sanctions. They crushed the economy. And as stupid as they are in Washington, they said, okay, we'll now pretend that Maduro's not the president. We'll just name another president from outside, Juan Guaido. And you have to think, is this a cartoon? Is this a fairy tale? Are these idiots that they think that from Washington they can name the president of Venezuela? But they actually tried to do this for several years. And I have friends in, well, they wouldn't call me friends, but in academia in the East Coast in the US that said, okay, I'm going to work for the new Guaido government. I said, Guaido government, because the US names him as president, he's suddenly president, you're going to work for him? Come on. So this is a deep and continuing tendency. The United States, it seems to me, forgot any kind of diplomacy. Diplomacy means you sit down and you negotiate mutual concerns. And by the way, to be successful, you show respect to the other side. And you try to listen to the concerns of the other side so that you can find a durable solution. That whole approach has completely gone. They don't even know how to negotiate. They have no interest in negotiating. They don't talk about it. This is amazing to me.
And there is actually a new study that shows that the rate of foreign intervention of the United States picked up after 1989 and didn't slow down. So the idea that the end of the Cold War would reduce interventions is actually wrong. This can be shown now. And one last question to you. Reconciliation with Russia. You wrote recently a wonderful piece on your homepage about how Kennedy would have made peace, and I mean John F. Kennedy. And in that piece, though, supposes two things. One, Kennedy supposed that the US and USSR were equals, and two, he supposed that both states wanted to make peace. Now, it strikes me that both of these assumptions are not true anymore. Or do you think the US thinks of Russia as an equal and as somebody that they want peace with, unless it is with Russia in broken up?
Well, the neocons had a plan to try to either overthrow Putin or to so-called decolonize Russia. I mean, it's a vulgar thing. They didn't want to deal with Russia as a counterpart country for negotiations. On December 17, 2021, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. This was the last off-ramp to avoid the Ukraine escalation in 2022. I urge the White House, talk now. Based on that document, there's a lot in there that's absolutely valid. Most importantly, stop the NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which has no sense and which is a Russian red line for completely understandable reasons. No, we don't talk to any third party about NATO, is the US refrain. That means we don't negotiate, we don't understand diplomacy, we don't recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns. And you end up with wars this way. Now, I continue to believe to this moment that if Biden said the words, we will recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns in a legitimate peace agreement that also respects Ukraine's sovereignty, that respects America's security interests and Russia's security interests, we could actually get to a negotiated peace. And pretty quickly, it would be based on Ukraine as a neutral country. A fact that Zelensky himself noted in a brief moment in 2022 until the United States told him to stop noting that and demanded that Ukraine shut down the negotiations. So Zelensky actually came back to what had been the basis of Ukraine's independence, the basis of its constitution, and the basis of an effective foreign policy for Ukraine neutrality. He came back to that. The United States tried to shut it down. Well, of course, the U.S. policy is failing badly, not for the first time, for continuously failing, because this is American foreign policy, but it's destroying Ukraine in the process. Can the two sides, U.S. and Russia, actually still end this through negotiations, this war? Of course they could. Even today, I keep saying, to Biden, if you want to talk, I'll give you my Zoom link. You can make a Zoom link with Putin. Go ahead. You want to borrow my cell phone? Call him. Start negotiations. They're basically cowards in the U.S. In the sense that they won't negotiate, because Kennedy put it right. He said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And they're afraid of negotiating in Washington, or they just forgot what it even means. So they don't have diplomats. I don't know what it is, but I've never seen anything like this. The absence of trying to find the way out of this disaster. And they need to open negotiations now.
What happened to Western values? Because it's a very interesting and important and strange story in a way, and it's worth reflecting on. The values that we heard about both Buddhist and Confucian thought clearly find some resonance in Christian thought, especially in gospel teachings of Jesus, and also in Greek thought, because if you look at Aristotle's philosophy, as was seen, you would find some connections that are quite important, actually, and I want to draw them out. But then Western philosophy took an odd turn, or Western thinking took an odd turn, and it's important to understand that change of values that took place starting around 1500 to today, because there really was a change of the Western philosophical approach and a divergence that is, I think, quite harmful in many ways. So if you look at Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, if I might, just very briefly, they're all in deep ways, not the same ways, but deep ways, variants of what can be called virtue ethics. The idea of virtue ethics is that human beings have the potential to do good, not the inevitability of doing good, and that virtues need to be cultivated to bring out the best in human beings. And this is a common idea of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius in the teachings. In Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path, there is the idea of the right view, the right action, the right speech, the right livelihood, and so on, as ways to cultivate the underlying virtues. Aristotle was very, very clear that happiness depends on virtue, but virtue must be cultivated. It cannot be taken for granted. And the main virtues in the Greek thought were virtues of what's called practical wisdom, or phronesis, which was the ability to choose the good over the enticing; temperance, which is moderation, which is a common virtue across all of these philosophies; bravery, which means the ability to defend the good; and justice, the ability to discern the right allocation for each person. And so those became the cardinal virtues in Western thought. But what was key for Aristotle was the idea that being virtuous is a potential of human beings, not a inevitability, because we are all bound by our bodily temptations, by our animal instincts, but also by our reason. So in Western Greek thought, reason was the predominant notion. This is not the same as in Eastern thought, but it comes to some similar points. And Aristotle said one must develop the habits of virtue. In fact, virtue or ethics comes from the word habit in Greek, that you practice, just as we heard, that you become altruistic by practicing altruistic acts. And Aristotle believed in mentorship, in education, in practice, in life experience as being vital. So here is a common basis that merges East and West virtue traditions at a quite deep level. And Christian thought, especially the teachings of Jesus himself as in the Gospels, are not the same basis. It's not exactly virtue ethics, but it is, of course, the virtues that are proposed, and especially also the Confucian golden rule is also Jesus's golden rule, although Jesus states it positively: do to others what you would have them do to you, and love thy neighbor as you love yourself. And that led in the early centuries of Christianity to a tremendous institutional focus of the bishops and the monasteries to care for the poor. And that was a real point, because the Christian communities, the emperors took care of their business and the bishops took care of the poor in a division of responsibility that started around the 4th century AD in the West. Skipping ahead 1,000 years, philosophy changed starting around 1500 in a rather deep way. And while Aristotle taught, for example, that politics is a field of ethics, and Aristotle's book, The Politics, which is the first book of Western political thought, no, let me say it's the first book of Western political science is the better way to say it, because Plato had written the Republic a generation earlier. But it's the first book of political science. It is paired with his ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, as two joined volumes, because for Aristotle, ethics and politics were the same. Of course, in 1514, I think it is, Machiavelli wrote a very different political science. He wrote a handbook for the prince, which was about how to maintain power. And political science in the West began to be the science of maintaining or managing power, not the science of producing the good. And in fact, Machiavelli was teaching the prince. He was actually making a job application back to the Medicis because he had been dismissed from the Medicis, wanting a job back that he was advising the Medicis how to hold power in Florence. Later, in the next century, one of the most influential texts in Western cultural history was written by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. And this was written in 1640 as Western science was taking shape. And Hobbes wanted a scientific theory of human beings, but modeled as individual atoms that collide with each other. Because for Hobbes, there was no longer a cultivation of virtue, but rather each individual with insatiable desires. So Hobbes's model of human nature is that it is simply unbounded desire. It can't be taught to moderate desire. It can't be cultivated for virtue. It is individualistic and it is insatiable. And so Hobbes said, unless there is an overarching power, people will kill each other. And so we need a Leviathan, he said, to stop human nature from committing non-stop violence. It was a very pessimistic view of human nature, but notice the main point is no longer was there any idea of developing virtue. That was deemed to be impossible. Instead, one needed institutions to reflect harsh reality. This is the flip of philosophy. It's no longer about cultivating the good. It is about controlling the bad. Then interestingly and importantly, this was amplified at the beginning of the 18th century, first by a very influential public intellectual, Bernard Mandeville, who wrote an essay in London called The Fable of the Bees. And in The Fable of the Bees, the most aggressive bees win, but they make the hive powerful and great. And if you try to control the avarice or the vice or the aggression of the bees, the hive actually dies. So this was now a philosophy of empire, that power seeking was good because it would make the society powerful and wealthy and able to dominate over the other bees. So it was taking Hobbes and adding another element, one beehive taking dominance over others. And clearly this was a philosophy that appealed to the emerging British Empire. Then came Adam Smith 6 decades later in 1776, and he said, in agreement with Hobbes and in agreement with Mandeville, that human nature is individualistic, tastes are unbounded, desire is a great motivator, but market forces will tame all of that, because market forces will force a kind of competition that will lead to a socially beneficent outcome. The point is, the Anglo-Saxon philosophy broke free of more than 1,800 years of Western tradition. The Western tradition from Aristotle and Christianity was a tradition of the common good, virtue, and care for the poor. With the rise of the British Empire, the philosophy became the benefits of power as a philosophy. And then even the idea that this would lead to, quote, the common good. But there are two more steps that are important to state. The poor became an enemy because now they were a drag on society. So John Locke, one of our most esteemed philosophers, wanted very harsh treatment for the poor so that they would not be burdens on society. And then came Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote after Adam Smith, one generation later in 1798. And he proposed something even darker, which is that those hives, those different societies, are actually in competition for survival with each other, because there are more people produced than can be supported. And so life is a battle for survival, and trying to help the poor is inevitably to fail because there will just be more poor people. That was his iron law of population. And that led in the next step. Darwin took that idea brilliantly from a scientific point of view to understand natural selection. But the later 19th century philosophers took that idea as a struggle across nations, and that now nations or peoples or races were in the struggle for survival. And this became known as social Darwinism. And the idea was not only should there be no beneficence, if you help your own poor, you will weaken your society compared to others, and indeed you're in a struggle for survival. And this gave rise to the worst crimes of history, because Nazism actually as a philosophy, which it was based on social Darwinist pseudoscience. And this idea, the German people will survive or the Slavic people will survive. And so this is a war even to extermination. Now, this kind of idea led to the worst cruelties, but we are still in a mindset in the Western world where it is competition and struggle that is the absolute underpinning of society. When I studied economics, I was taught about perfect competition. I was never taught even 1 minute about perfect cooperation. The idea doesn't even exist in economics. It's not even developed in one paper that I know of, because the idea of cooperation as a norm doesn't exist. It happened, this notion of letting greed motivate action perhaps did generate the spirit of innovation to some extent. But the way that it was championed and taught, of course, led to the worst excesses. So the world became rich, and those who were rich became devoid of benevolence and compassion. And a terrible writer in the United States who became quite popular, Ayn Rand, a kind of popular philosopher among young people and among many politicians, wrote a famous essay about the virtues of selfishness. So selfishness became the virtue, actually. That's the literal title of an essay. It's unbelievable. And she is championed by many still. These novels are unbearable to read, but they are part of our philosophy. So I went on too long, I know, because the sign told me to stop 5 minutes ago. But so that's not very benevolent of me. But let me say the following. I believe we've had a deviation from the right path in Western civilization. There are roots of Western culture that we can really use to find a path of virtue and politics that is ethical. But the Anglo-Saxon version deeply lost this tradition. And there are many fascinating reasons for this, but it was mainly the rise of power of the British Empire, which was in many ways an extremely nasty empire. And the United States learned everything it knows from the British Empire because it aims to be the continuation of the British Empire after World War II. And this is what needs to end: a world that can return to the common ethical principles of virtue. Now, let me just conclude by saying I am hopeful that this can actually happen. And I think you at the table need to help lead that. And we need to help explain these things. And when President Xi Jinping launched last year the Global Civilizations Initiative, I think that this is actually an important opening that is very positive, because China has said we should go back to our roots of culture to find a way forward, which I very much subscribe to. And the GCI, or Global Civilizations Initiative, is an invitation across civilizational wisdom. And I hosted a meeting in Athens last month, co-hosted with the Academy of Athens, a Aristotle-Confucius symposium on ancient wisdom for modern challenges that brought together Chinese and Western philosophers. We didn't have Buddha properly at the table except one very distinguished Buddhist thinker from Cambodia, but we need more of that. At the end of this meeting, we agreed that we would have a second symposium. This time, I hope it is the Aristotle Buddha Confucius Symposium in Shufu, in Shandong province in July. I hope we could participate together in that. We will be back for that. Many philosophers are interested in that. I will be in Shufu in next month for the Nishan Forum, which is also a philosophical forum, but the Shandong government has asked to host the follow-up meeting of the Aristotle Buddha Confucius Symposium. And I believe that this idea of East and West deep philosophical traditions, finding the deep humanity that is common across them, is extremely important and powerful, and can really contribute to an understanding which right now doesn't exist. And I think the failings of this understanding are overwhelmingly on the Western side, if I may say so, because we are steeped in a philosophy of competition and even war. And this mindset is taken as given, but it is actually a recent phenomenon. It is an imperial phenomenon, and it needs to be put aside. So I believe that this actually can be done. Can I have 2 more minutes? Because I want to talk about net zero by 2050. And first to say how much I admire what Dr. Shaw proposed, and is the book in English also, or in Chinese?
English,
Okay, we're going to have to get me an English translation somehow, if we can. But I'm very eager also to read your forthcoming paper. Let me add a couple of things that I think are central, but I think they're already exactly in your climate club idea. It is not possible to reach net zero one country at a time, least of all for an island. We need an interconnected energy system, region by region, because if you are tapping renewable energy, it's intermittent. So it's sunny here or windy here. This needs interconnection. And East Asia should be interconnected in a common grid. There is a mainland China program called GuideCo. Cooperation Organization that is the China State Grid engineers who are doing analytical work on interconnecting regional grids for Africa, for South America, for North America, for Europe, and for Asia. This is very important work. Taiwan should be connected to the mainland in a power grid. And the mainland should be connected with Mongolia, and it should be connected with the ASEAN countries, and with submarine system. It would be region, the economic powerhouse of the world, rather than a battleground, because this region has everything if it works together. And it could lose everything if it views the region as a battleground. I think everyone in this region can understand this. The only one that does not is my country, actually. But the U.S. needs to be told, let us solve our problems. We know how to discuss. Don't meddle, because you will make a mess. This is actually the truth. This is true about Japan. It's true of zero carbon energy and all the cooperation that would the regional cooperation, the regional structure, and pose and probably roadmaps that show the physical interconnectedness, what technologies, where, as I've been saying, opposite of a plan. It's 80% fossil fuel. What plan is that? Nothing. Please, don't encourage them. So, show fantastic work. Sonia and I were just in Beijing with them a couple of days ago. We'll come back for a meeting that they're hosting on September 26th for a worldwide meeting on energy interconnections. I think that this is really absolutely at the core. So I agree with everything that you said, and I think that it's absolutely the way forward. And in that polycentric world, there's a concept which I find very useful. It's a concept adopted by the European Union, but a concept that actually started with the Roman Catholic Church, and that is the concept of subsidiarity, which is that we need governance at all levels. So we need global governance, regional governance, national governance, local governance. You put each problem at the lowest level possible, closest to the people, where it can be solved, but not below the level at which it can be solved. So the power grid cannot be solved at the national level. It must be solved at the regional level. The targets for decarbonization must be solved at the global level, and so forth. And the idea of subsidiarity is that we have this multiple levels. We have global governance. We have a global government that can do certain things and not other things. We have regional government. We have national government. We have local